Okay, so I'm going to replace this crankset with a power meter instead. First thing to do is get the chain out of the way, and then you use a torx wrench on these bolts on the back. Now for this one, if you listen carefully, you can hear a horrible noise because I used the wrong size. There you go, that's a T27 when it should have been a T30, but anyway I got it right in the end. And the nice thing about these Dura Ace chain rings is you can get them off without having to take the crank off if you need to swap them. So get them out of the way, and then on the back you have these pinch bolts on the non-drive side that use a hex key, 5 or 6 mil I think it is, to remove 2 of those. Loosen them off almost all the way actually, and then there's also an end cap piece that you have to unscrew as well with a little tool that goes in the end there. A little bit more loosening of those, and then you can pull that crank arm off. And then just come round to the drive side, and that slides out relatively easily. Now this tool here, this one's made by Park Tool, is used to push out these press fit bearings. So you slide it through and the flangey bit at the end just opens up on the inside of the bearing, and you basically give it some welly. That's a good idea to hold the bottom bracket as still as you can while you're doing this, because you don't want to stress the bike too much. So you try and take most of the impact with your hand. But obviously leaving the bearing free to come out. These ones are called BB86, I think, on these Shimano road press fit bearings, and sometimes they just call them Shimano press fit. It's a bit confusing. But the 86 is the width of the bottom bracket shell, and this one was a bit determined not to come out. That piece in the middle there is just the sleeve that the axle goes through, spindle rather, for the crank. But a few more taps and this comes out, just bracing the frame against my arm there so it doesn't move too much. You can see it's starting to come out. Probably won't be using those again. So this is the new bottom bracket. Now for this power meter you have to use a SRAM GXP bottom bracket instead of the Shimano one. Slightly different because it's a bit narrower on one side than the other. Tapers. I think the drive side is slightly wider and the non-drive side's a couple of mil narrower. And you're supposed to fit these by just doing the non-drive side first, I think it is, and pressing it against the shell. But since the Shimano ones tell you to fit those by doing both at the same time, I figured it'd probably be okay for this. It doesn't seem to be machined quite as accurately as the Shimano one. It didn't want to go in straight at first. This is a tool that I made. You can get a proper press for this, but I used the Park Tool bushing things to brace against the edges of the housing there so it doesn't damage the bearing. And most of those headset presses and bottom bracket presses are pretty much the same principle as this. The nice thing about the proper ones is that they will go on dead straight. They'll centre themselves on the bearings. So mine is a little bit Heath Robinson. And it meant I had to mess around with this a little bit to get it straight, but it got there in the end where I was happy with it. So this is the final thing I've edited out of the few attempts where I wasn't quite happy with the angle that it was lined up at. And then it actually goes in fairly easily. Some people put Loctite, can't remember the number now, some Loctite thing that stops the bearing from slipping, or the housing from slipping once it's in the shell, but I've not had a problem with them so far, creaking and whatever, so I didn't bother. And I figure that's going to make it harder to get out anyway later on. So this is the real last attempt. And it just kind of closes up on both sides at the same time. I just pushed this in far enough for it to close solidly against the shell. I don't want it being pressed any harder than that, really. Okay, get that out of the way, and then there are these little protective bits you put on the outside of these SRAM ones. There's one with a kind of flange pattern on the other side, which I'll fit later. So a little bit of grease on the spindle, and then just slide that in. Oh yeah, there's a little wave washer that you're supposed to fit on here on the drive side. Now I made a stupid mistake there. I didn't put the small chainring on, and that circular piece on the middle of this Quarq crank set is too big to fit the small chainring over, so I had to take it all off again. And we'll do it again with the chainring in place. A little arrow triangle on the inside there. Do it with the numbers facing towards the frame. That little triangle lines up with the crank arm. You can almost certainly double and triple check that before you actually bolt the two chain rings together. That's the other protective bit I talked about earlier. Push that on there to cover over that bearing on the non-drive side, and then the other arm goes on, and these SRAM GXP things just use a 8mm hex key to tighten up on the end, which says it's supposed to go to 45 to 50 Newton meters, but that seemed too tight to me, so I used my torque wrench to get it up to about 30, and that turned nice and freely, and it seemed absolutely solid. And there you go, that's with the extra chainring added.